So as many of you may know, and some of you may not know, is we kind of have it's really kind of critical timing at the federal level, and even at every provincial level right now, in that at the federal level, we have the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence, which has been put into place. And when we started planning this convention, I kind of reached out to partners across the country, and thanks to Ali Crockford at Writing Relations Canada, reached out to Ending Violence Association and able to connect with Erin, and started talking about, what is the implementation of this National Action Plan look like, and how do we move it forward as a collective across the country. So it was really beautiful to have Erin work with us and to identify this issue, but also figure out, like, how do we bring the right people together to have a conversation to push this forward. And so just so you know, so Erin is the Executive Director of the Ending Violence Association of Canada. And prior to her taking on her role, she was a senior researcher with the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, is a registered social worker, and has over a decade of experience working in community-based, academic, and government settings on a variety of gender equity issues. So Erin, super excited to have you here. I'm gonna bring you on stage with me as I kind of maybe introduce the other people. It's like bring you all on. And we're super excited to have Lise Martin as well with us. Lise is the founding executive director of Women's Shelters Canada, an organization that provides a unified voice for systemic change to end violence against women, while providing leadership for collaboration and knowledge exchange among shelters and transition houses across the country. Prior to that role, she was executive director of Women's World 2011, an international feminist conference that hosted more than 2,000 participants in 92 countries in Ottawa in July 2011. That's a huge undertaking. So Lise, we're looking forward to having you with us, and I'll just kind of add you all to the stage as we bring you on. And then I know Deepa's here too. Super excited to meet Deepa. Deepa is an award-winning lawyer and an intersectional feminist whose work is rooted in equity and anti-oppressive and anti-racist practice. She's executive director of the Barbara Schriffler Commemorative Clinic, and Deepa provides leadership to the various departments and for the clinic's intervention and advocacy work, and has appeared before parliamentary committees and UN civil society meetings. Deepa, we're super excited to have you with us today. And Angela, very nice to meet you as well. We have Angela with us, who's the executive director of Battered Women's Support Services. And through her community-based organizing, frontline work, curricular development, training, and activism over 3 decades, Angela has been deeply involved in movements for gender, racial, and social justice. Her impact includes the development of empowerment and advocacy-based programs and service delivery models that address gender-based violence and violence against women that are grounded in theoretical frameworks that include intersectional feminist trauma and violence-informed analysis. So we have got 4 powerhouse women with us this morning to really challenge us in our role as civil society, but also just as organizations and at the federal level, to how do we really move this action plan forward. So super happy to have you all. And Erin, I'll pass the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Renee, and welcome to the audience here today. We can't see you, but we're imagining that you're out there listening. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to talk a little bit more about the National Action Plan with our panelists here this morning. But I did just want to start off by acknowledging that today is, of course, December 6th, the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. It's a day that commemorates the lives of the 14 women who were murdered in an act of technique. And it's also a day that we remember and honor the lives of thousands of women and girls who are missing, who have been murdered, or who have been severely harmed through acts of male violence and other forms of gender-based violence. According to the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability, 169 women and girls have been killed in Canada so far in 2023. And we've also seen with the Mass Casualty Commission earlier this year and the Renfrew County Inquest calls for government to declare gender-based violence an epidemic in Canada. And so this can be a really difficult day for people. It can be challenging when we hear these statistics, and particularly when we really think about the individual behind each of these numbers and the impact of their loss on their families and communities. I'm sure we have folks listening today who are survivors themselves, who have been impacted by violence, or who are working in their communities trying to make change. And it can sometimes feel difficult or feel like we're not making a lot of difference. So I just want to encourage everyone listening today to make sure that you do what you need to do to take care of yourselves during this conversation, and just to know that we really honor the work that you are all doing. It's also important, of course, to acknowledge the extent of the crisis of gender-based violence in Canada and the urgent need for action. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on in our conversation this morning as we get into a discussion about the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence, speaking about this through our lens as people who work in community with survivors and anti-violence organizations across the country. I'm really pleased to hold space for this conversation with our panelists today, all of whom have been working for many years on issues of gender-based violence and in relation to the National Action Plan. So before we get into the discussion, I recognize that perhaps people listening have various levels of kind of familiarity with the National Action Plan. You may not even really know what the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence is. So I just want to give a very, very brief kind of overview of where things stand right now with the National Action Plan from our perspective, and then we'll unpack that more in the discussion. So first of all, what is a national action? Studies and experts recommend the development of a national action plan or strategy as an effective tool to combat gender-based violence comprehensively and in a coordinated way. These plans typically involve coordinated approach across multiple sectors of government, civil society, and stakeholders. They also should have an accountability and oversight mechanism, monitors and evaluates the implementation of the plan. In Canada, the federal government released the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence on November 9th, 2022, so just over a year ago. This plan is organized around 5 pillars or areas of action: support for victims, survivors, and their families, prevention, responsive justice systems, implementing Indigenous-led approaches, and social infrastructure and enabling environment. We saw in budget 2022 an investment of $539.3 million over 5 years, starting in 2022, to support the provinces and territories in their efforts to implement the National Action Plan through the development of bilateral agreements with each of the provinces and territories and the federal government. And so since November 2022, over the past year, we have seen the announcement of these various bilateral agreements. As of today, as far as I'm aware, we know that there have been agreements in all of the provinces and territories, with the exception of BC, Newfoundland, and Nova Scotia at this point, that have been announced. And while we know that these agreements have been signed, we have limited and varying levels of detail about the content in these agreements, but it is our understanding that once all of them are signed, they will be made available publicly. So that's a really quick overview, and I'm sure we'll get into more of the details as we get into our discussion. And I'm wondering if it might be helpful to kind of ground where we are today at the present moment with the National Action Plan in the long history of advocacy that has taken place to really press government for its development. And Lise, I'm wondering if you want to start. Women's Shelters Canada has been a leading voice pressing for the development of a national action plan for over 10 years now. Could you just give us a little bit of an overview of this history and what's really motivated you and Women's Shelters Canada to persevere in your efforts to see a national action plan developed and implemented?
Sure. Thank you, Erin, for that. And nice to be here with my colleagues. So Women's Shelters Canada is a fairly young organization. We're 10 years old, and this was one of our first priorities, So in 2013, we published a paper on why Canada needed a national action plan. And in 2013, at the Commission on the Status of Women, which meets every March at the United Nations, and which generally has 2 thematic areas per year, violence against women was one of the thematics that year. And it was felt at that time that the federal government might actually announce a national action plan or the creation of a national action plan for Canada, because the UN had called on all countries to have national action plans by 2015. And so that did not happen at that time. And as we were a very young organization, I brought together 10 organizations that worked at the national provincial level to basically bounce off the idea that rather than continue to advocate for a national action plan within a federal context that would not necessarily lead to what we were looking for, that it might be best if we use our time, so basically 2 years, in anticipation of the federal election in 2015, to develop together what we felt were the priorities that needed to be reflected in a national action plan. And so that happened with the support of 8 unions who each provided $5,000. And we brought together 22 organizations that worked, again, at either at the provincial or national level to develop what we called the blueprint. So the blueprint for Canada's national action plan, with the view that we would collectively use it as an advocacy tool in the 2015 election. And so shortly after the 2015 election, the newly elected Liberal government came out stating that a national action plan, before doing a national action plan, they felt they needed to get their house in order and therefore would develop Canada's federal strategy on gender-based violence. And so this strategy was launched in 2017. The strategy has 3 pillars, whereas, as we said, the National Action Plan has 5 pillars. But the blueprint, I guess, I wanted to say that the blueprint, the pillars that were identified by the federal government reflect how we had organized and what the priority areas that we had identified in the blueprint at the time. And so the blueprint was updated for the 2019 election. And at that time, all of the political parties, with the exception of the Conservative Party, had a national action plan in their budgets, in their platforms, I should say. So we fast forward to November 2022, when Canada finally announced its national action plan on violence against women. And prior to this, given our role with the blueprint, the federal government reached out to Women's Shelters Canada in late 2020 to request our assistance in the process of developing the National Action Plan. And so the result was a very intense 5-month process that brought together the brilliant minds of 40 GBV experts from across the country and produced what we now call Canada's roadmap to the National Action Plan. And so Erin, Deepa, and Angela all played important leadership roles in the development of the roadmap. And I'm wrapping up, but it's a 10-year history. So what has motivated us to persevere in our efforts? Simply put, what we have always said is that the levels of services and protection provided to women and children should not depend on their postal code. And for many years, there were good discussions between civil society and both civil servants and elected officials. And we were encouraged by the fact, as I said, that the priorities, the pillars, as they have called them, in both the federal strategy and the NAP reflected the 4 priorities we had identified in the blueprint back in 2015. I think the National Action Plan has also been an important rallying point for GBV organizations and partners to work and strategize together. And now that the agreements have been signed, we are counting on the provincial territorial governments to reach out to the GBV sector in terms of the implementation of these agreements. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Lise. And it's just so interesting to hear the long history and all of the years of work that have gone into getting us to where we are today, and just how important it is that we get this right. As Lise said, both Deepa and Angela, you were really involved in the development of the roadmap to the National Action Plan. And I'm wondering if we can dive a bit deeper into how civil society and in particular anti-violence organizations are being involved in these next steps of the National Action Plan and the development of the bilateral agreements, and why it's so important that these organizations are at the table. Angela, I'm wondering if you just want to just talk a little bit about, from your perspective, why it's important for anti-violence agreements, and if you like, maybe share a little bit about what this has looked like in British Columbia.
Most definitely, and thank you, Erin, for this opportunity to be here today. I'm here in the unceded ancestral territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people, and it's still early in the morning. The sun just came up a few minutes ago here in Vancouver. It is such an honor to be here and to have this conversation to talk about human rights on this important day of commemoration as we remember and mourn. And I just have to give so much respect and love and appreciation for the work of Lise, who, Lise, you've been incredible in putting the National Action Plan literally on the map here in this country that we now call Canada, and doing such incredible advocacy. And what it's meant for me, I felt like I was, here in the West, where so often I complain, and maybe others do, about really missing out on those national conversations and those conversations that are so often, it seems like, are siloed within the border of Ontario and Ottawa and Toronto. So it was, I felt like it was my duty to try and reach Lise and to say, listen, like, hey, like, and I, knowing that there was provincial representation, but also wanting to have an opportunity for us as a relatively small community-based organization based here in Vancouver that's been doing work to end gender-based violence since 1979, to be able to weigh in on what it means for a national action plan, and to do that in a way that would be reflective of what we consider a decolonial intersectional approach, and what that would mean then for a country like Canada and thinking about gender-based violence and a national action plan. So it was an honor to be able to work with all three of you, Deepa and Erin and Lise, of course, and all of the other 40 individuals representing various organizations, as we were looking at some really important considerations. And the challenge has been, of course, in thinking about it nationally, what that means provincially with these bilateral agreements that you've both spoken about so far. And in working on the national plan with all of you and with others, it also, I thought, gave us and me the mandate, if you will, to really push here in British Columbia to have our local provincial government and also municipalities to recognize the necessity of a plan, that this National Action Plan was coming, and to prepare for it. But also to preparation, meaning that engagement with local organizations that were formally and informally doing work around ending gender-based violence. And so, the provincial government, here in BC is, I think, unique in the sense that it has for many years recognized the issue. They have been really, in many ways, wanting to, present themselves as a government that is taking action. We've wanted, of course, to move some of that attention that most of the funding and community-based services has been coming through this idea of public safety, which has aligned us with policing and has kind of tied the interventions based on being for victims in relationship to the criminal legal system. And so we've been really pushing to broaden that out and to decentralize that, to make that broader. And the National Action Plan and the roadmap, which I'm hoping that everyone here will get a chance to read. It's Women's Shelters Canada has a site that has that information, really gives us a roadmap for what it would take to be able to provide that essential those interventions for victims and survivors all across the territories, coast to coast to coast. So it's been a lot, to say the least. And as Lise mentioned, British Columbia is one of the provinces that's has yet to make its announcement. I always think that announcements come during moments like this, where we're in the 16 days of activism. So the provincial government has an opportunity to make that announcement, I think, during this time. So and we are encouraged to be able to continue this work and to really move a plan. There are some considerations, though, that I'm hoping that we'll be able to talk to at some point. So I've spoken a lot. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela, for that. And I think you give some really good examples of why it's so important to have community-based anti-violence organizations at the table, given that they're the ones who are really seeing what's happening on the ground and bring that expertise. Deepa, I know at the Barbara Schleifer Clinic, you've done some work looking at how involvement from civil society organizations is a really important part of creating accountability and oversight measures. Can you talk a little bit about this connection between the involvement of civil society and accountability, and maybe any examples from what you're seeing in Ontario?
So thank you so much, Erin, and for organizing the panel, and thank you for the hosts of the conference. On a somber note, we are meeting together on December 6th, and this is definitely a day for people who work in the sector, ending gender-based violence. Like for us, it's a day of reflection. It's a day of reminder for why we do what we do every day. Coming to the question, and again, my work with Lise, Angela, I want to acknowledge, Erin, that, it's not a coincidence that we are on the panel together, that we have done all this work. And thank you, Lise, for the leadership of Shelters Canada, under which umbrella we came together to work on the roadmap project. Coming to the question very quickly, I think the interesting intersection of accountability and partnerships with the civil society organization is something that is given to us from the very basic instruments which kind of expect countries to have a national action plan. So it's very much rooted in the international commitment that every country will have. Every country that is committed to ending gender-based violence within the UN framework will have a national action plan. And this relationship of civil society organizations with the government and the state power is rooted in the fact that civil society organization will consult on creation of the plan, and the civil society organizations will then help monitor the plan. And we know that in the current framework, there is a monitoring commitment, and we are really, really excited about it. But the monitoring and the implementation and how they go hand in hand is something that we haven't necessarily gotten a complete clarity on so far. And we are very collaborative from various different levels, right from the local level to the provincial level, to the national level. And it's not necessarily us only. There is a much larger group of people working on this mandate. And there are people who are asking for those meetings at the local level. So in Ontario, something which is sad and exciting at the same time that is happening is that a lot of municipalities are declaring gender-based violence as an epidemic coming out of an inquest recommendations. So that in itself is an instrument of activism that is happening at the local level, and municipalities are coming on board, which means that municipalities are now creating small roundtables within their regions these national action plan conversations are reaching those tables and the conversation is happening, what is the accountability mechanism that can be engaged at that level? Similarly, at the provincial level, as the announcements are happening, so in Ontario, the announcement of the bilateral treaty just happened very recently. And I know that an organization, OAIT, which leads like the same shelter movement that Lise's organization leads at a national level, they lead it at Ontario level, and they have been in communication with the government. I have to say that it's not at the level of where probably, say, I as an organization working with the survivors would like it to be. I think we would want these conversations to be at a more advanced level, but things are usually slow. And accountability is usually always looked at as something that will be monitored and accountability will happen as things roll out. So this morning, there was an announcement made by the Ministry of Social Services and Children's Affairs, which is basically the ministry in Ontario, which gives out money for the gender-based issues. And there is an announcement that has just come out this morning. We are absorbing that announcement and seeing what that means. There is a lot of conversations that have been happening since the bilateral treaty was announced, but the monitoring is not at the level where it should be. But why is monitoring important? Very quickly, because the clinic engaged in a research earlier this year to kind of figure out, like, why is it important? Why are we as stakeholders, as civil society organizations, interested in that? Because we are where the data is. We are where the real lived experience is. Whether the one that comes to us or whether that gets missed from coming to us, in both areas. We are also where the engagement with the community directly is. So there is a lot of us and who work with community engagement frameworks in various ways. So if there is a national action plan rolled out and there is this money that is coming to the communities, the community engagement is where you would know where that difference is happening or not happening and where the gaps are. We are the ones who do advocacy for legal changes. We are the ones who do advocacy for accountability measures. So as feminist organizations, we are the ones who keep their feet to the fire. So therefore, it is really important to engage with the people who are your monitoring body. And that's the gap that I find very interesting, because we are all accountable for what we do. So the government is accountable for what they are doing. And National Action Plan is such a joyous moment for us. We are so excited about it. So therefore, it is really, really important that the government actually participates with us in this process. Something which is really interesting in our engagement, and I'm using we as a very broad framework as feminist organization working in this environment, we are invited to speak to the various committees and decision-making bodies. We are invited for government for their consultations when they're changing laws, when they're changing policies. So it is only natural that if we are invited to all those tables, that we are also invited to monitor and evaluate how this National Action Plan is making a change. But we are very practical. We know that this cannot happen in one day. We are also very practical that we know that the money that is allocated right now is probably not the only money that is needed. But if we don't measure and evaluate, then I think we will be missing a huge opportunity to see where the needle is moving. And that moving of needle is that what we all are waiting to see to happen. And that's where this partnership lies. And that's what, at least the gathering of the information that we have done so far, is no country has done it correctly. No country. So that is a bit of a disheartening information at a global level, but it is the opportunity for Canada to do it right.
Thank you so much for Deepa. Thank you so much for that, Deepa. And just, I think just such an important explanation of why that accountability and measurement and evaluation is so important. And the perspective, like you said, community-based organizations, gender-based violence organizations are where the data is, and bringing that into this work is so important. Lise, just as a final kind of question on this topic. National organizations like Women's Shelters Canada have a unique, because you often work closely with members and partners across the country and can kind of get an overview of some of the similarities and differences. Again, just kind of thinking about this theme of gender-based violence organizations, civil society organizations, and their involvement in the development of the bilateral agreements or the National Action Plan more generally. Could you just share any observations about kind of what you're seeing at that national level and the way advocates are being involved?
I guess you know, whoops, I was hearing an echo there. I was going to say, as I've noted before, prior to the launch of the National Action Plan in November 22, I feel there had been really active engagement between the federal government and civil society and the gender-based violence sector. Whereas in the years since the launch of the National Action Plan, there has been very little communication. It's been it's been a marked contrast in terms of our levels of pre-engagement and now. And I think, you know, having spoken to the associations, the shelter associations across the country, there was limited, very limited engagement in terms of the sector at the provincial level with their provincial governments in the development of the agreements. Now, obviously, there are some exceptions, but by and large, there was not a huge amount of engagement there. And so now that the agreements have been signed, we feel this is definitely the moment where there needs to be engagement, active engagement with the sector, all levels of the sector in the provinces and territories. And I think as Deepa just was, you know, laying out, it is really important that we also be involved in that evaluation, that accountability evaluation mechanism. It's, you know, it is good practice in terms of having external evaluations, and I think we need to be part of that, and to be brought in right up from the get-go. We need to be involved in the development of those measurements. How are we going to measure? What type of information is going to be collected? So I am hoping for further engagement. Although there hasn't been much in the last year, I'm hoping for further engagement.
Great, thanks, Lise. And yes, I would echo that. What we've been seeing at Ending Violence Association of Canada in our conversations with provincial sexual violence networks across the country is, again, not a huge level of engagement in the development of the bilateral agreements, with some exceptions. And like you, I think we are hoping to see that involvement increase once these agreements are released and there's the opportunity to kind of give some feedback and input on those. I'm wondering if we want to just take a moment and kind of bring this conversation back to what we're seeing on the ground right now, in terms of the levels of gender-based violence, the needs of survivors, and the pressures on organizations that are providing frontline services. I mean, these are all reasons why we're so adamant about this National Action Plan working and being shaped by advocates and survivors. I know many of the organizations that I've been speaking with and that we work closely are seeing folks who are not only reaching out for support related to violence, but also with housing, economic insecurity, mental health, substance use, a lot of other intersecting and complex needs. It's a really difficult time for a lot of people, and especially for those who are experiencing gender-based violence. So I'm wondering if from each of your perspectives, you could just kind of bring into conversation what you're seeing in your organization or the organizations that you're connected with in terms of the needs of survivors, the needs of those working in these organizations, and just to connect it back to the National Action Plan, you know, how you see or whether you see the National Action Plan as useful in addressing these realities. Deepa, would you like to start us off with that?
Yes, thank you, Erin. And, you know, as you were asking this question, I was reflecting on that ending gender-based violence and the and the National Action Plan roadmap, that the project that we worked on together, something that is probably, that pink elephant in the room that stands for all of us all the time is the resources and the funding, right? So that was very clear at the time of the roadmap project as well. But if any of you get an opportunity to read the document, we didn't actually just keep on talking about that. That was, yes, definitely one thing that we talked about. But I think from a very basic level, at the ground level, of course, the staffing, the funding, the ever-increasing rates of clients and survivors and people with lived experience we work with, and not having enough hands on the deck to support the rate increase with that. And also, we exist in an environment where it's mostly women identifying folks working in this sector. We are working with folks who are, not paid properly, not given enough resources. Not only the salaries are low, the training and the opportunities to grow are low. So it's a sector that is designed in precarity. So that's like one angle of the challenge that, and I say designed in precarity because I say that, this sector has been providing the very important basic human rights need, really the fundamental needs of the people, and it's still designed around precarity. So that means that there is someone not paying attention to the design of the sector itself. It's very, I say this, with a lot of compassion and empathy, but think about it, that people who are actually fighting for the equity for all live the most unequal life, and that is a bizarre tragedy of the sector, which this National Action Plan can probably pay some attention to, and then resource can be allocated in a way that the organizations that have been doing the work on shoestring budget can actually get some living wages. They can actually get some decent work environment created. But that's not it. That's like one side of it. You have to zoom in and zoom out all the time in these conversations. And when you zoom out, there is a lot of policy fixing, a lot of straining of the decision makers, and there is a lot of legal changes that are also required. So it needs to happen in two places. We have a huge challenge with mandatory charging, for example, and we see in our clinic, we see the experience that mandatory charging, which was designed actually to protect survivors, survivors see themselves being criminalized in the system very frequently, and it's the most marginalized survivors. We are talking about Black women, racialized women, Indigenous women, non-status women, migrant women. So if that's what the environment is, it needs fixing and rebuilding at the same time. And anyone who has ever done a renovation of a house, how difficult that is. Building up from the ground is easy. Renovating is difficult. And that's what this is requiring. This is requiring to breaking, rebuilding, but also supporting at the same time. And that I think makes it really, really complex. But if one thing a well-designed National Action Plan could have done is create those guiding framework, which could bring some kind of uniform understanding, which is lacking, because we have a very diverse, geographically diverse country. We have a population-wise a diverse country, and everyone's need is different. So one size fits all does not work for the population that we are working with. And so if there could be a common framework of understanding, and if it was a National Action Plan based on the framework of equity, it would provide that equity framework as a starting point so that we can actually start from the same place. That, I think, is the bare minimum that we are hoping that this would do. And I know I started with funding and not ending with funding, because usually I end with funding ask. But I think that funding is really becoming very, very important, because housing crisis in the part where I am is at its peak. The poverty rates are really high. People who are needing to line up outside the the food banks is really high, and the hatred against the communities who need support is mind-boggling. Like, I am so disappointed when I see food banks coming forward and saying we are not meant for specific populations, which in our region recently was around international students, not understanding that people don't live siloed life. An international student can also be a survivor of violence and can also be a survivor of poverty and also be a survivor of all of those other things. So that lack of understanding of intersectional experiences of people is something that I think that a national action plan should be able to dismantle, and we should all have an equity framework to start with. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Deepa. Angela, I'm wondering if you want to build on that and talk a little bit more about what you're seeing at the Battered Women's Support Services, and I know the work that you've been doing around accessibility to services and some of those challenges and gaps.
So the Deepa is so correct in in how you've spoken about this, Deepa, in terms of the context and the we've come through this time through COVID-19, in 2020, and now we're here at 2023. It feels like a lifetime, of a lifetime, and we've watched through social media and through our efforts kind of looking at these issues that we understand that have been around, but we're seeing them now in through being reflected in what social media has been a way to kind of bring a more democratic approach to media. And so we've had a regression. I mean, there's no question that we've had a regression. I think that we had a moment where into 2019 where we maybe were seeing hope, and that the efforts of our activism and our work on a number of different fronts were making a difference. We were seeing that. We had a moment where, and we've had a regression, and I think we're grappling with that regression because it hasn't stopped. That we keep kind of sliding into a space, and as we're talking about the 75th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights. We have to recognize, like, we are seeing a regression in human rights, both here on these lands, but all around the world. And at the heart of it, of course, are the same things that are at the heart of gender-based violence here in this country, in the sense of colonization, racial capitalism, patriarchy. And as we're commemorating a day and honoring the killings, femicide of women who were engineers, are studying to be engineers, and this mass femicide, which is kind of a recognition. But we've had several mass killings already in Ontario, within the last 3 years, as recent as the last couple of months. So this is what we're dealing with right now: is these deeply entrenched challenges that we started to make maybe a little bit of an inroad and could see a moment of where we could make some difference, and we've had a regression. So what does this mean right now, where we're at right now? It means that we're really challenged right now, but we're also exhausted on many levels. And that's, I think, well, maybe speaking for myself, I'm exhausted on many levels because of the urgency of this time. And it's been urgent. It hasn't stopped being urgent. So when I think about the National Action Plan, it's another opportunity. It's another opportunity, I think, for anti-violence organizations, community-based organizations all across the land to then, take action in the ways that make sense, both in the sense of patriarchy, hold our, governments, but our communities accountable for, for these issues. Because the government has a role to play, but who is the government ultimately but the people? And so there's some things that I think we're going to have to be paying attention to over the next while around whatever democracy means, whatever all of these terms mean in real life right now, because, I am seeing a lot of violence in the sense of all of the individuals that come, to our door, call our line, and violence, that is happening in so many ways, and it's escalating. It appears to be escalating so that's where, you know, that's where I'm at, and that's where I think our organization's at, as we attempt to link arms with everybody across these lands, but across the world, as these issues are for all of us. We're a global community, and as we are thinking about human rights.
Great, thank you so much for Angela. It was very, very powerful sharing and reflection. Lise, I'm wondering if you just want to add to that again, just speaking from your perspective at a national organization. I know Deepa spoke about some of the challenges facing people working in organizations in the gender-based violence field. I know Women's Shelters Canada has done some work on that. Do you want to talk a little bit more about just kind of what you're seeing and how the NAP can play a part in addressing some of these challenges?
Sure. So as we're not a frontline organization, I'm going to focus on the needs of those working in the GBV sector. And over the last year, we conducted a study on the situation for shelter workers, which we called the feminist brain drain. And as in so many professions, caring professions, the pandemic has been very challenging for the sector and its workers. And so in our study, we saw an increase in workload was reported by 60% of the respondents. And not surprisingly, this was accompanied by an increase in the level of stress, which was reported by 76% of respondents, and a decrease in overall mental health reported by 47% of the respondents. And from our 2022 edition of Shelter Voices, so that was right in the middle of the pandemic, of the 243 shelters that responded to the survey, it was reported that 1,300 frontline staff and 126 executive directors, managers left their organizations in that last year. And so we also know, in terms of the challenges, that, you know, women coming to shelters have increasingly complex needs, and often shelters are not always equipped to meet these needs. And also the fact that there's just this overcapacity, that all our services, all the shelters, the helpline that Angela runs, the clinic for Deepa, having to turn women away. And this is extremely stressful for the workers who are, you know, put in these situations every day. In terms of the National Action Plan being useful in addressing these realities, via the National Action Plan, there will be additional federal funds for gender-based violence going to the provinces and territories. So the intent of it is, to our understanding, is that the bulk of these funds are to be redistributed to the sector. And so what will be important to us is the need for that transparency and accountability that we've talked about. And that would truly, we really, as a sector, we should be able to follow the money and ensure that the investments are truly being directed to those most impacted by gender-based violence.
Great, thanks, Lise. And I think that's a really good lead in to our next couple of questions. And I'm just being mindful of the time to make sure we leave a little bit of time for some questions here. But just thinking a little bit of sort of big picture challenges and opportunities with this National Action Plan. I'm wondering if each of you want to speak to, you know, what you see as kind of the major challenges that we face in Canada in making progress on this National Action Plan. Lise, would you like to start us off with that?
The greatest opportunity, right?
Let's do the challenge first, and then we can
challenge first. Okay. Where am I? Because I had here the challenge. Okay, sorry. Okay. Communication. I guess for me, one of the challenges is it's not clear how the provinces and territories are going to work together. To again ensure that the levels of services and protection are not dependent on a postal code. So that's one piece. Another challenge is that in terms of the financial resources, although, you know, the additional resources from the federal government are obviously welcomed, we had, and we do see this as a beginning, in the roadmap, we had called for billions, not millions. And we strongly feel that is necessary given the scope of this issue. And again, accountability and transparency, you know, providing that information that will help us follow the money. And we're looking forward to seeing that from the governments, both at the federal and provincial levels in the coming year.
Yeah. Great. So challenges around just a lack of clarity about how the provinces and territories are going to be working together, the need for more financial resources and investment in this, and then just getting clarity around that accountability mechanism and what that looks like. Angela, do you want to add to that in terms of what you think some of the sort of the challenges are here in making progress on this?
So I think I talked about the challenges. Maybe I think about the opportunities. The opportunities that the NAP and the bilateral agreements offer is, again, this community-based organizing on these levels that are about the individual survivors, and because survivors remain the experts of our experiences and are necessary in this. All those community organizations to be able to really help to push for on the funding side, but also on the change side, which has to do with funding. But I think part of what we've talked about so much, and I'm hoping that will be kind of in a part of the planning going forward, is to really make sure that we are building on those 5 key areas that are in the roadmap. And I hope that everyone here today will get a chance to check out the roadmap. But there's an executive summary, which will give you some basics if you want to get into more beyond that, because that gives so much information about the opportunities. And to take some of that back to your communities and with your community organizations and with family, faith centers, the places where we are convening, and to be able to have those conversations and to be able to really make the NAP come alive in our communities. And that's the opportunity, because the good thing about the roadmap, which I am so grateful for, is that it does touch on those root causes of violence. It does name those root causes of violence, and it also names all these ways that we can make change. So it's a roadmap for the government, but it's also a roadmap for ourselves and for our communities and for our community-based organizations.
Great, thanks, Angela. And that roadmap report is available online. I think the website is it nationalactionplan.ca, Lise?
It is, and I just actually put it in the chat for
perfect.
Who's ever controlling this, if they can share it.
Yeah. Okay, great. So Deepa, I'm wondering, just to bring you in here, if you wanted to add to just this conversation about the challenges that you see with the National Action Plan and its implementation, and maybe move into also the opportunities as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think in terms of the challenges, both Lise and Angela have kind of covered it. It's the effective collaboration, right? Effective collaboration between the civil society organizations and the government. I think if the collaboration and coordination happens effectively, this could be a moment for a change, which we all have been waiting for. But unfortunately, I'm not seeing that open communication or that inclusive decision making. I'm not seeing that resource sharing so far as much. But again, as I said, this is Canada's opportunity to do it right and do it in a way that actually creates that monitoring and evaluation. And we could probably be the country which can set an example for everyone. So here is an opportunity for sure. In terms of some of the other opportunities that I think are really important is and this is a bit philosophical, so bear with me. No social change can happen unless and until there is a social conscience raising that happens around an issue. And a social conscience raising around gender-based violence requires public awareness, because public is that goes into politics and public is that goes into courts, and then they make decisions, right? So which means that we need to have an education strategy which starts with young people, which starts with young men and boys, which starts with an inclusive intersectional analysis. I know that someone mentioned in the comments that can we think about that all these different action plans actually come together and work? Absolutely, because gender-based violence is not a siloed experience. It is an experience that is rooted in the socio-economic, racial experiences and the history of colonization of this country. We can't ignore all of those factors. And if that are the factors that influence the experience, then we have to consider a solution that is layered and intersectional and takes into account of, anti-racism strategy, takes into account of our Indigenous solidarity and truth and reconciliation and the findings of MMIWG, like all of those housing strategy, inclusion around ability, and all of those factors need to come together, including our immigration and refugee protection laws, which are twisted and turned based on what the country needs. How many people we need to bring in, how many people we need to send, and like that control mechanism influences the experience of gender-based violence in this country. And I think that's where I feel like there is a huge opportunity that lies around raising of the conscious understanding of what GBV is. It is not a private matter between two individuals. And unless and until we are not able to shift that, the shift cannot happen. And I think that this National Action Plan should be that opportunity to have that conversation.
Thanks so much for that, Deepa. And I think as sort of a last question here that you've already started to answer, I was reflecting on the fact that, all four of us spend a lot of time thinking and working on issues of gender-based violence and the National Action Plan. But there may be folks who are joining us today who, who've never heard of the National Action Plan before this panel, or who aren't in this in their sort of day-to-day lives. I'm wondering, in closing, if each of you just want to share some thoughts about, why the average person should care about the National Action Plan and how it's being implemented. Deepa, you already kind of spoke to this in your explanation of around this opportunity for consciousness raising and making gender-based violence more visible. Is there anything you'd want to add to that?
My only other thing to add to that would be to shift the cultural norms and think about how do we actually be very, very intentional about it. The cultural acceptance and impunity of gender-based violence has created the environment of it to continue in 2023. And as we are entering 2024, I think the intention should be that we shift it and we raise our voice at every given opportunity. And yeah, that's probably what I would say needs to happen.
Great. Thanks so much, Deepa. Angela, would you like to just share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that that we know, and certainly was highlighted in the roadmap, is that friends and family have such a key role in creating opportunities for change, both in the sense of survivors, victims, and survivors, but also to help play a role as an advocate and a support. So I think that would be the thing that I'm hoping that we can be one of the takeaways when we think about the National Action Plan and what that's going to mean in the provinces and territories, and for those here, is how can we be a sustaining place for survivors to land for ourselves within our friends and family and community networks? How can we be a sustaining space, knowing that the journey of healing, the journey of addressing, the journey of accountability is long. So it does mean that we have to be there for a sustained time. But how can we do that work for ourselves and for our communities, and to be a place where survivors can find safety and those that do harm can be held accountable?
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Angela. I think you really speak to the fact that everyone does have an opportunity to create this change that I think we're all talking about today, and that awareness raising is so important. Lise, is there anything you'd want to add here as sort of a final comment on this question and the National Action Plan in general?
Sure, and I am going to bring in another challenge.
Yes, sure, yes.
What what Deepa and Angela were saying, because one of our concerns is that the plan as it's laid out now is not going to get to systemic change. And I think, that is a real concern if we're to address the needs of the most marginalized, so Indigenous women, Black women, racialized women, women with disabilities. We need to make that systemic change in order to start addressing equality. And I think, we need to address gender-based violence. If we're to achieve gender equality, we have to, gender-based violence is at the center there. I do think that gender-based violence is a nonpartisan issue. And so it's important that we remind ourselves of that. And the National Action Plan does provide that opportunity to work on this issue as a nonpartisan issue. But and it's also a societal issue. It has a huge impact on society, including an economic one. And given that some people, that's really how they measure things, I think that needs to be brought in. But I think we as a sector know what needs to be done. We now need to put the resources behind it and put action behind the words.
Thanks so much thanks for that, Lise. And thank you to all three of you. This has been such a rich discussion. I want to make sure we have a few minutes here for questions and comments. So maybe I'll turn it over to the panel, the moderator. I guess that's me, but whoever is managing the comments, and to let us know if there's any questions from the audience.
Can you see that question up on the screen there, team?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll let you respond.
Okay, sorry. So we have a question here about how we hold government accountable to putting action plans or roadmaps into place across changes in administration. And I mean, Lise, I think that just speaks to the point you just made about this not being a partisan issue. Does anybody want to speak about that in more detail? Oh, and the question just disappeared.
I think, our organizations, it's always important how we, what's that expression? Keep the foot on the fire, or like we have to stay on top of it. We have to continuously be talking about the issue. And again, seeing the continuum, I think that's really, Deepa, you talked about that. So the continuum from prevention to change to also supporting people today, now, is really important. But it definitely is a preoccupation, I would say, of all of us, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if I may add to that, Lise, that it goes back to the whole partnership around monitoring and evaluation, right? Like if civil society organizations are, on the table monitoring, then obviously those plans will remain accountable. And I think one of the challenges that we are right now currently trying to figure out is that how do we remain part of that, either ourselves or as official partners in either of the two situations. In terms of us keeping people accountable, there is a complex reality, again, another pink elephant that I want to draw all of your attention to, that many of us, especially like I'm thinking about myself, there's an organization and there are people depending on the organization who are getting services. There are 14,000 people who get services from this organization. And when that change in the political office happens, that brings a lot of precarity, a lot of sense of what would happen next, when your next agreement is going to be renewed or not renewed. So there is a factor of that the precarity by design that I talked about earlier, that is also another lived reality. And therefore, our our partnership with Lise, for example, from her organization, which is an organization that is not doing direct client service, but is voice of the organizations like ours, is so very important. So all of our umbrella organizations like EVA Canada, Shelters Canada, in Ontario we have OA, OCASI, all of these organizations and their relevance becomes very, very, very important for us during those phases of transition, because those transitions are never easy for us, because it brings that sense of turbulence. And thankfully enough, I think this is a nonpartisan issue, as Lise said, and many of us have been cruising through those turbulent times. But I want to acknowledge for all of you that those are turbulent times, nevertheless.
And so we have another question here asking that, or stating that any action plan needs to start taking disabled people into account and how systemic issues are causing worse violence against disabled women and non-binary and disabled parents experiencing violence. So yeah, for sure. And I think this is a sort of a comment and question, again, just talking about the need for there to be an intersectional, the National Action Plan to really reflect and put into practice an intersectional approach to these issues. Does anyone else want to kind of comment on that, that comment there, that question?
I know that Dawn Canada, which is the national organization that works with women with disability, was also very much engaged with the federal government in the lead up to the National Action Plan. But again, that now it's in the hands of the provinces and territories, and it will be, again, about measuring and that accountability to what extent they are taking an intersectional approach in terms of how the different national, provincial plans will be rolling out.
Great. And I apologize, sorry, I think things just froze for me for a minute there, so I may have missed something, but I do see that there's another question that has come up. Did we finish answering the other question there? Yeah. Okay, so the question here we've got, the UN, if I understand correctly, the UN requests consultation with civil society to create the plan, but this plan was rather moved by civil society organizing itself and using the blueprint to push for the National Action Plan. Lise, did you want to just speak to that?
Yes, definitely. I would say that it was civil society that has been pushing the plan, since 2013, and has always ensured that it was there on the radar. Yeah.
But at least just a point of clarification, the plan itself is not written by civil society organization. I just want to clarify, that the roadmap is the roadmap that civil society organization under the leadership of Shelters Canada co-authored. The plan, which is completely different document, is not authored by us.
No.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification, Deepa. I think that is really important for the audience to know, because I think there can sometimes be confusion that the actual National Action Plan that was written by the federal government is on the Women and Gender Equality website and can be accessed there. So thanks for that, Deepa.
I just want to quickly have a comment just about the nonpartisan piece, which of course gender-based violence is nonpartisan. And governments have their own theory of change and their own theory of understanding of how the world works and understanding of what communities need, and though gender-based violence is nonpartisan, we're always in this situation of wanting to point out the experiences of women and gender diverse people within an intersectional framework, including, as the question addressed, with respect to disability and other forms of inequity. And that is, that's our challenge. That's our challenge, is to continue to bring that analysis and to share that analysis. And as somebody mentioned in the comment about we need to be provincially organizing around the plan right now, yes, because as Lise mentioned, most of the plans have been signed and they're now, I guess, going into effect in some way. So you should want to know what the plan is in your territory or province, and you will want to learn about what your provincial government or territorial representation is doing right now around that national action plan, and how it becomes alive, to what degree it becomes alive within your province or territory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to add to that too, Angela, as I said at the beginning, as we understand, once all of the agreements are signed, they are going to be supposedly released publicly. So people, would likely want to take a look, keep their eyes open for that, and to take a look to really see what's in these agreements and how the money has been distributed, and take a deeper look at them. So I think we are coming up to the end of the panel in terms of time here. But I just wanted to say a big thank you to our audience, first of all, for joining us this morning and listening to this conversation and your interest in this issue. And a huge thank you to Lise, Angela, and Deepa for your insights this morning and all of the work that you do every day to support survivors and work to address gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Erin, for bringing us together.
Thanks.
Thank you.